Okay, welcome to CBY630, Emerging Cyber Threats, and the first module that we're going to talk about is the module relating to risk management. And I chose this because regardless of what we talk about for the remainder of the course, when we talk about emerging threats, we should also be thinking about ways to remediate those threats. And we cannot really do that unless we have a firm understanding of the role that risk management plays in the field of cybersecurity, and in this case, as it relates to emerging threats. Now, one thing that you're going to realize, and for those of you who have been working in the field for a while, and those that have been doing a lot of reading, pretty much a beaten path as it comes to risk management as it relates to information that's put out in academia. Pretty standard approach to the risk management process that's being taught. Some of you have probably seen these slides before. If you've taken any information security classes or if you've taken any type of training, these are all pretty much the same. It doesn't matter where you go or who you're taking it from. It seems like in the field of academics, we're pretty stagnant on the role or the information that we put out about risk assessment. So I'm going to go through these slides. This is a good primer for those who have not had much exposure to it. It also gives us the opportunity to talk a little bit about some common approaches. And then I'm going to put out another presentation that is about a risk assessment or risk management methodology that I developed a few years ago that I think is a little bit different spin, and I'll explain that more when I get to it. Basic learning objectives that we have, for this module. We want to define what risk management is, risk identification, risk control, how we would go about identifying risk and assessing it, assess risk based on probability of occurrences and likely impact. And I believe that these terms have kind of popped up in some discussion modules. And then some fundamental aspects of documenting risk via the process, sometimes referred to as risk assessment. We also will talk about some basic risk mitigation strategies, categories that can be used to classify controls, some conceptual frameworks for evaluating risk, and how to formulate and do a cost-benefit analysis, and then how to maintain and perpetuate risk controls. So the security systems development life cycle is really a process that serves as a framework or a methodology that can be used in a flexible fashion to assist organizations in deploying information security initiatives. A risk identification is the formal process of examining and documenting the current information technology security situation in any given organization, and then risk identification is conducted within the larger process of identifying and justifying risk controls, and this practice is called as risk management. One of the things that risk management and risk analysis does for an organization is it allows you to, or it requires you to identify, examine, and understand the information and the systems that are currently in place. And in order to protect your assets, what we would want to do is to have a good understanding of everything about that information as it exists. The systems that use it, that store it, and transmit it. So this risk management and risk analysis process really allows us to get a good understanding of where information is used, how it is stored, and who is using it within our organization. Once we've examined all these aspects, we can then look at what we are already doing to protect the information and the systems from threats. Look at the components of risk management, we'll see that there are really three individual activities or components with a bunch of subcomponents. Starting on the left, risk identification is really the first thing that we have to do. Identify and inventory all assets. We're going to want to classify and prioritize the assets in some order of importance, and how an organization goes about doing this is really unique to that organization. There are a variety of ways of prioritizing it, and it really depends on how you want to do it, and that's unique to that particular organization. Once we've classified them and prioritized them, we want to identify and prioritize threats that are specific to those individual assets. Once we get through the risk identification process, we'll move to the risk assessment process, where we are going to identify vulnerabilities between assets and threats, and then identify and try to quantify the asset exposure. The final portion of the risk management process is that of risk control, where we're going to select a risk control strategy. We're going to justify any controls that we wish to put in place, and then we're going to implement and monitor those controls. And keep in mind that this is, again, a cyclical process. So just when we finish, we're going to start all over again, and we're going to redo the risk assessment process or risk management process on a periodic and rotating basis. When we talk about information security, we want to make sure that we include all the various roles of all the various communities of interest in the evaluation of risk controls, and the determination of which controls are most cost effective to the organization, and making sure that we have input from all of those communities of interest when we talk about acquiring or installing new or needed controls. And then obviously we need to have the entire organization participating to ensure that the controls remain effective and appropriate for the risk at hand. So if we talk about risk identification, basically calls us or asks us to know ourselves by identifying and classifying and prioritizing the organization's information assets. These assets are often the targets of various threats and threat agents, and our goal is to protect them from those threats. So once we've gone through the process of self-examination, we can then move into threat identification. But first we must assess the circumstances and settings of each information asset. To begin managing the risk from the vulnerabilities, we must identify those vulnerabilities, begin exploring the controls that might be used to manage the risks, and we begin the process by identifying and assessing the value of the information asset. And some components of risk identification include people, procedures, data, software, and hardware. So we want to make sure that we are doing a good comprehensive review and not focusing just and only on the technology. So again, the first steps of the risk identification process is to follow your basic management principles, project management principles, by having an organization, organizing a team with representation across all of the communities of interest within the particular organization. It should be very planned process. It should have deadlines, and it should have deliverables, and it should be a very comprehensive, well meted out process to ensure that it is effective and thorough. Basic components of risk identification, as the methodology, standard methodology, plan and organize the process, categorize system components, inventory assets, inventory and categorize assets, classify and prioritize assets, identify and prioritize threats, and then specify asset vulnerabilities. And you'll notice that this is cyclical. After each step, you're working your way back through to make sure that you have a good comprehensive process in place. So asset identification and inventory. This is a process that begins with the identification of assets, including all the elements of the organization's systems, including people, procedures, data, and information, software, hardware, and all the networking elements. Then we can classify and categorize the assets, adding details as we, dig a little bit deeper into the analysis. But the first thing we have to do, again, is come up with a good comprehensive list of all of the individual components of the organization. Little chart categorizing the components of information system, and on the left, again, people, procedures, data, software, hardware, the system development lifecycle components, employees and non-employees, as a part of the people category. And then they further break them down over here under the risk management control components as trusted employees or other staff, people at a trusted organization or strangers. And you can do that. Really, this is just a sample or for you to look at, but you can come up with your own categories. If we look at people, procedures, and data asset classification, unlike tangible hardware and software elements already talked about, the human resources and documentation and data information assets are not as easily or readily discoverable and documented. These assets should be identified, described, and evaluated by people using knowledge, experience, and judgment. And this is where it's important that you bring in individuals from other areas of your organization, the human resources department, the accounting department, the IT folks, and as these elements are identified, they should be recorded into some sort of reliable data handling process. For people, perhaps, you would want to identify them by position, name, or number, who they report to, their security clearance level, any special skills that they might have. How you do it is really unique to your organization, but it has to be consistent. We do not want to classify individuals within one department one way and go to another department and classify them in a different way. And the same with the procedures. We want to have the descriptions, what their purpose was, what is tied to it, storage locations, and data classification is the same. Do we want to do it by owner, creator, manager, data structure used, online or offline location? These are all things that you have to, as a risk management group, determine in advance and then move forward with in a consistent manner. If we look at hardware, software, and network asset identification, there are a lot of automated tools that can uncover the system elements that make up your hardware and software and network components, but you have to make sure that it's a comprehensive list, so you're going to have to do some verification. And you can do it in a bunch of different ways: MAC address, IP address, serial numbers, manufacturing names, software versions, physical and logical location. Any way that you do it, once created and stored, the inventory list must be kept current, and often you will want to do it on a frequent basis, especially if you have mobile technology involved in your network that moves from place to place or location to location. You're going to want to make sure you keep a current list. Data classification and management. There are a variety of classification schemes that are being used by corporations and military organizations. The key here is consistency. Information owners are responsible for classifying the information assets for which they are responsible, but they must all do it in the same manner. You do not want to have one portion of your organization using a classification scheme of secret, top secret, and super secret, and the other using public, non-public, and private. We need to make sure that we're consistent from location to location, and we also have to make sure that we are consistent with the definitions of each category. That's critical. You don't want to have different interpretations for what is confidential, what is private, and what is secret. We want to be consistent across the organization. Most organizations do not need a detailed level of classifications like you would see in the military and federal agencies. A simple scheme really allows for the organization to protect its sensitive information, public for official use only, sensitive, classified, whatever. It just has to be consistent and it has to be understandable. And each of those categories that you use should be mutually exclusive. No piece of information should fit into two categories. If we look at security clearances, On the other side of the data classification scheme is personnel security, clearance structure. We classify data, secret, top secret, and super secret. We also have to give the same clearances to individuals that will be using that information. For each user of data within the organization, a single level of authorization must be assigned. This indicates the level of classification that he or she is authorized to view. Before individuals are allowed to access specific sets of data, they must meet the need to know requirements. This extra level of protection ensures that the confidentiality of the information is properly maintained. Some other things that we would want to make sure that organizations are doing: management of classified data. Requirements for management of information include storage, distribution, portability, and also the destruction of classified information. Information that's been classified, that has a classification designation other than unclassified or public, must be clearly marked as such. And when classified data is stored, it must be available it must be made unavailable to unauthorized individuals. And when individuals carries classified information, it should be inconspicuous, and it should be in a secure state, whether it be encrypted or in a secured or locked briefcase or portfolio. Often, in the risk management process, we come across policies, and one such policy you'll see in most organizations is this clean desk policy, which requires employees to secure any and all information in its appropriate storage container at the end of the day. There are those individuals who would not hesitate to engage in dumpster diving to retrieve information that could prove embarrassing to companies, the security of the information of the organization. And this includes, and we have to make sure we remember, when we pay another organization to destroy our garbage for us or destroy our drives, we want to make sure that it's done in a meaningful and secure way. If we look at information asset classifications, we will recognize that many organizations already have some sort of classification scheme. Examples of these kinds of classification schemes are confidential data, internal data, public data. Informal organizations may have to organize themselves to create usable data classification model because it's important that they have this in place. It helps us categorize, and it helps us understand the value of that information. The other side of the data classification scheme, again, is that of the personnel security, which we mentioned. And each of these categories, remember, we're going to classify data and personnel, secret, top secret, super secret. They must be mutually exclusive, and they must identify the level of information each individual is authorized to view based on his or her need to know. Information asset valuation, as each asset of the organization is assigned a category, you have to begin to ask some questions that help us understand, or will help you understand, the criteria to be used for asset valuation. And there's just a couple of them that are here. Is it critical to the organization's success? Does it generate revenue or profitability? Would it be most expensive to replace or protect? Would it be embarrassing or cause great liability if revealed? These are just sample questions that you might want to use to help classify or value information assets. But you have to come up with some questions, and you should use these questions consistently across all of your information assets. And then in order to finalize the step, each organization should create some sort of weighting for each category based on the answers to the previous questions. Which factor is the most important to the organization? Which one is not so important, where we might not weight it so heavily? Once each question's been weighted, we can calculating the importance of each asset's pretty straightforward. The final step is to list the assets in order of importance, and this can be achieved using a weighted factor analysis worksheet. We talk about threat identification. Each of the threats identified has the potential to attack any of the assets protected. If we assume that every threat can and will attack every information asset, this quickly becomes so complex and so overwhelming that you actually have an inability to plan the risk management process. To make this part of the process a little bit more manageable, each step in the threat identification and vulnerability identification process should be managed separately and then coordinated at the end of the process. Again, there's some questions that you could ask yourself: which threats present danger to the asset, which most danger to the information, which would cost the most to recover from attack, which threat requires the greatest expenditure to prevent. And then, a little bit of a threat chart that you might see compromises the intellectual property, and an example of that would be copyright infringement or piracy and so forth and so on. And these can be created by an organization as they brainstorm through their process. Vulnerability identification. Once you've identified all your assets and thought about all of the threats that might occur, now you have the challenge of reviewing each information asset for each threat it faces and creating a list of vulnerabilities that remain viable risks to the organization. Vulnerabilities are specific avenues that threat agents can exploit to attack information assets. This process works best when you have a very diverse group of individuals with diverse backgrounds from the organization working in a series of sessions, brainstorming sessions, to try to come up with the most comprehensive list that's the most accurate and most meaningful. Risk assessment is used to determine the relative risk for each of the vulnerabilities through the process of risk assessment, and again, we're assigning a risk rating score to each specific information asset, which is very useful in gauging the relative risk introduced by each vulnerable information asset and making comparative ratings later in the risk process. Again, all we're trying to do is give meaning to each individual asset's importance to the organization, the corresponding threats and the vulnerabilities associated with those, so that later on we can determine which ones we're going to protect using which control strategy. If we talk about likelihood of an attack coming to fruition, we really talk about probability that a specific vulnerability will be the object of a successful attack. And there's a bunch of different ways of assigning numeric values. You can use, low and high, 0.1 and 1, 1 and 10, numbers between 1 and 0. I like to use numbers like 1 through 10. I think that it's more meaningful to do that than 1 through 100 or 1 through 1,000. I think the larger the scale you have, the more difficult it is to determine actual risk and then make comparatives between the two. But this is personal preference. Organizations do it in a variety of different ways. Note that you should not use a 0, since vulnerabilities with 0 likelihood would be removed from the rating, from the asset and vulnerability list, so we would never use a 0. Everything has a risk. Use selected rating models consistently across your assets. Don't change. And it's also important that you try not to change from period to period. Remember, this is cyclical. If you come up with a rating scale and you're going to use 0.1 and 1 as your high and low, for consistency's sake, you may want to consider doing it for a few cycles to make sure that your ratings are accurate and meaningful before you decide to change them to go maybe to like a 1 and 10 or something like that. For the purpose of relative risk, we use a basic equation that says risk equals the likelihood of a vulnerability occurrence times the value or the impact minus a percentage of risk already controlled plus an element of uncertainty. And the element of uncertainty is really what throws individuals into disarray when it comes to determining the risk management process. Just like we can never actually have perfect security, we're never absolutely going to be 100% certain of all the calculations that we do during the risk management process. So we always have to add in always have to take into account an element of uncertainty. For each threat and its associated vulnerabilities that have any residual risk, and residual risk is that amount of risk that's left over after we put a control into place, you should create a preliminary list of control ideas. That's can be done in three general categories of policy, programs, and technologies. And what we're going to attempt to do there is to apply some sort of control to those vulnerabilities. Finally, we're going to look at the goal of the process and remind ourselves that it has been to identify the information assets of the organization that have specific vulnerabilities, create a list of them ranked for focus on the most needing protection first. When we make that list, we have collected and preserved a wealth of factual information about the assets, the threats they face, and the vulnerabilities they experience. We should also have collected some information about the controls that are already in place. And these are all things that we're going to need to know and understand when we determine or we decide to select our risk control strategy. Once we've determined the risk from information security threats, they really empower the information technology and information security communities to control that risk. And once the project team for the information security development has created the ranked vulnerability worksheet, the team can choose one of the four basic strategies to control risks that result from these vulnerabilities. Basic risk strategies are to apply safeguards that eliminate or reduce the remaining uncontrolled risk for the vulnerability, transfer the risk, reduce the impact, or inform themselves of all of the consequences and accept the risk without control mitigation. And then obviously, we have those strategies, but they're not unique. Organizations can come up with other control strategies, but the basic ones are defend, transfer, mitigate, accept, and defend. If you choose to defend, is the risk control strategy that really attempts to prevent the realization or the exploitation of the vulnerability. This is the preferred approach, as it really tries to avoid risk in its entirety rather than deal with it after it's been realized. Avoidance is accomplished through countering threats, removing vulnerabilities in assets, limiting access to assets, and or adding protective safeguards. The most common method of avoidance involves three control areas: application of policy, training and education, and then putting technology in place. Transfer is a control approach that really tries to shift the risk to other assets or other processes or other organizations. If an organization does not already have quality security management and administration experience, it could hire individuals or firms that provide the expertise. This allows the organization to transfer a portion of that risk associated with the management of those complex systems to another organization, with the established experience in dealing with those risks. Mitigation is the controlled approach that attempts to reduce the impact caused by the exploitation of the vulnerability through planning and preparation. This approach includes three types of plans: incident response planning, business continuity planning, and disaster recovery planning. Mitigation begins with early detection that an attack is in progress. The most common of the mitigation procedures is the disaster recovery plan. The DRP includes the entire spectrum of activities from activities to recover from an incident. It includes strategies of limiting loss before and during the disaster. DRPs usually include all preparation for the recovery process, strategies to limit losses during the disaster, detailed steps to follow when the disaster has ended. The actions of an organization can and should take while the incident is in progress should be defined in a document referred to as the incident response plan. And the IRP, or the incident response plan, provides answers to questions victims might pose in the midst of a disaster. What do I do now? What should the administrators do first? Who should they contact? What should they document? So forth and so on. The importance of these plans cannot be overstated. They are absolutely critical for any organization's long-term success. The next control strategy that we talk about is acceptance, and with this approach, an organization evaluates the risk of the vulnerability and allows the risky state to continue as is. The only acceptance strategy that is recognized as valid occurs when the organization has determined the level of risk, assessed the probability of attack, estimated the potential damage from, if the attack were to occur, performed a thorough cost-benefit analysis, and then evaluated the controls using appropriate types of feasibility analysis, and decided that the particular function, service, or asset did not justify the cost of the protection. Acceptance of the risk is a choice to do nothing to protect the vulnerability and accept the outcomes of the exploitation. This control, or better stated, the lack of control, is based on the assumption that it may be a prudent business decision to examine the alternatives and determine that costs of protecting an asset does not justify the security expense. The next control strategy that we would look at using is the control strategy of terminate, and the control strategy really directs that the organization to avoid the business activities that introduce the uncontrollable risks at all. They seek alternative mechanisms to meet the customer needs. Selecting a risk control strategy is, again, must take into consideration the level of threat, the value of the asset, in selecting the appropriate control strategy. Some basic rules of thumb that can be followed to applied and can be applied in selecting the preferred strategy. When the vulnerability exists, implement assurance techniques to reduce the likelihood of the vulnerability being exercised. When the vulnerability can be exploited, applied layered protections, architectural design, administrative controls to minimize the risk and prevent this occurrence. When the attacker's cost is less than his or her potential gain, apply protections to increase the attacker's cost. For example, using system controls to limit what the system user can access and do, thereby significantly reducing an attacker's gain. And then when the potential loss is substantial, apply design principles, architectural designs, and technical and non-technical protections to limit the extent of the attack, thereby reducing the potential for loss. Basic risk handling decision points that you can look at on your own, but again, it's just a flow chart that walks you through the risk handling decision process as it relates to what type of control strategy you may wish to use. Once you've chosen your risk control strategy or looked at the available options, all information about the economic and non-economic consequences of the vulnerability facing the information asset must be explored. And fundamentally, we're asking, what are the actual and perceived advantages of implementing a control contrasted with the actual and perceived disadvantages of implementing the control? The cost-benefit analysis is the approach most commonly considered for projects of information security controls and safeguards is the economic feasibility of implementation. An organization begins by evaluating the worth of the information asset to be protected and the loss in value if those information assets are compromised by a specific vulnerability. It is only common sense that an organization should not spend more to protect an asset than it is worth. The formal process to document this is called the cost-benefit analysis or an economic feasibility study. Some factors that you might want to look at as the impact of cost of a control or safeguard include the cost of development or acquisition, training fees, cost of implementation, service costs, cost of maintenance, lifetime expectancy, so forth and so on. Once an organization has estimated the worth of various assets, it can begin to examine the potential loss that could occur from the exploitation of the vulnerability or a threat occurrence. This process results in an estimation of the potential loss per risk. The question that must be asked here include what damage could occur, what financial impact would it have, what would it cost to recover from an attack, in addition to the cost of the previous question, and then what is the single loss expectancy of an individual risk or for each risk. Again, annualized loss expectancy is equal to single loss expectancy times the annual rate of occurrence. So how much does it cost one time when an incident occurs? How many times does it occur in a given year? Equals our annual loss expectancy. And then, single loss expectancy equals the asset value times the exposure factor. It is, in its simplest definition, cost-benefit analysis is whether or not the control alternatives being evaluated is worth the associated cost incurred to control the specific vulnerability. While many cost-benefit analysis techniques exist for our purposes, the CBA is easily calculated using the ALE from earlier assessments. Cost-benefit analysis equals ALE prior minus AEL post. In other words, what was the annual loss expectancy prior to putting a control in place? What was the annual loss expectancy after we put the control in place? And then the annual cost of that safeguard. Selection and implementation of control strategy is not the end of the process. As I mentioned, it's a process that continues as long as the organization continues to function. So this is not a one and done situation. You need to remember that once you finish it, you're going to start the process again, and it's cyclical in nature. Basic flow chart or flow process of selecting risk control cycle. Again, identify the assets, prepare a vulnerability risk assessment sheet, and then you work your way through the process, flipping back to the control strategy and starting the process all over again. So then we can talk about different risk assessment methodologies, qualitative versus quantitative. Again, really, we're talking about performing all the previous steps using actual values or estimates is known as quantitative. Utilizing scales rather than specific estimates is really the qualitative process. Whichever you choose is completely unique to your organization or from organization to organization. One way is no better or worse than the other. But for consistency's sake, you're going to want to stick with one method for a given amount of time in order to ensure consistency. We've talked about it before. The benchmarking process is an alternative strategy to cost-benefit analysis, and its attempt to place hard dollar figures on each information asset is to approach risk management from a little bit different angle. Instead of determining the financial value of information and then implementing security as an acceptable percentage of that value, an organization could look at what their peer institutions are doing to determine what others are doing to protect their information. That's called benchmarking. It's the process of seeking out and studying practices used in other organizations that produce the results you desire in your organization. When an organization participates in benchmarking, it typically uses one or two measures to compare practices to determine which practice it would prefer to implement. These are metric-based measures and process-based measures. When organizations adopt levels of security for legal defense, they need to know that what they have done was what any prudent organization would do in similar circumstances. This is referred to as a standard of due care. It is not sufficient to just implement these standards and then to ignore them. The application of a control at or above the prescribed levels and the maintenance of those standards of due care show that the organization has performed due diligence. Due diligence, again, is the demonstration that the organization is diligent in ensuring that as implemented standards continues to provide the required level of protection. Failure to support standard due care or due diligence can open up organizations to legal liability, provided it can show, or it can be shown, that the organization was negligent in its application or the lack of application of information protection. Best business practices, again, is an effort to seek to provide a superior level of performance in the protection of information that are sometimes referred to as best business practices or simply best practices or recommended practices. Best security practices are those efforts that are among the best in the industry, balancing the need to access with the need to provide adequate protection. Best practices seek to provide as much security as possible for the information in the systems while maintaining a solid degree of fiscal responsibility. When you consider best practices for adoption in your organization, you should consider some of the following. Does your organization resemble the identified target organization of the best practice? Are the resources you can expend similar to those identified in the best practices? A best practice proposal that assumes unlimited funding and does not identify needed trade-offs will be very limited in value if your approach has strict resource limitations. And then, are you in a similar threat environment as the proposed in the best practice? A proposal of best practices from months and even weeks ago may not be appropriate to the current threat environment. So those are some of the things that you would want to look at. And as we've talked about before, I believe that there's some real issues with best practices and benchmarking. And perhaps the biggest problem in information security is that organizations do not talk to each other. Another problem with benchmarking is that no two organizations are identical, especially if we're talking about the culture of that organization. Third problem is that best practices are a moving target. What worked well 2 years ago or 2 months ago may be completely worthless against today's threats. And then, one last issue to consider is that simply knowing what was going on a few years ago, as in benchmarking, doesn't necessarily tell us what to do next. Approach to mitigating or handling risk is this concept of baselining. Baselining is the analysis of measuring itself against established standards. In information security, baselining is the comparison of security activities and events against organizations' future performance. When baselining, it's useful to have a guide to the overall process. Many organizations do this. It's just another way of measuring yourself against performance or expected performance. There's some other types of feasibility studies that we'll mention briefly. Again, they're really examining how well the proposed information security alternatives contribute to the efficiency, effectiveness, and overall operations. Above and beyond the impact on the bottom line, organizations have to determine how the proposed alternatives contribute to the business objectives of the organization. Risk management and discussion points that we want to touch on. Not every organization has collective will to manage each vulnerability through the application of controls. Depending on the willingness to assume risk, each organization must define its risk appetite. And then risk appetite defines the quality or the quantity and nature of risk that organizations are willing to accept as they evaluate the trade-offs between perfect security and unlimited accessibility. Graphical representation of this concept of residual risk. And again, residual risk is just that amount of risk that remains after the safeguards have been put into place to mitigate the exposures from the vulnerabilities, the threats, and the actual asset itself. It is that what is the organization is comfortable with having still exist as it relates to threats to that particular asset. And of course, because this is a process that has to be followed on an annual basis or semi-annual basis, documentation is very important. At a minimum, each information asset vulnerability pair should have a documented control strategy that clearly identifies any residual risk remaining after the proposed strategy has been executed. Some organizations document the outcome of the control strategy for each information asset vulnerability pair as an action plan. This action plan includes concrete tasks, each with accountability assigned to an organizational unit or an individual. We must convince budget authorities, and this is where the management process of risk management cybersecurity come into play, that you really have to convince the individuals that control the budget to spend up to the value of the asset to protect a particular asset from an identified threat. Each and every control or safeguard implemented will impact more than one threat asset pair. So it's important when you determine what your control is going to be that you try to select controls that will address multiple threats. This makes it more palatable in the financial area. Between the impossible task associated with the valuation of information assets and the dynamic nature of the ALE calculation, it's important. And it's not surprising that organizations are looking for a very straightforward method of implementing controls that does not involve imperfect calculations, which most risk management processes do. So in summary, risk identification, the formal process of examining and documenting risks. Risk control is a process, carefully reasoned steps to ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Risk identification enables the identification, classification, and prioritization of an organization's assets. 5 basic control strategies that you should be familiar with: defend, transfer, mitigate, accept, and terminate. And then, selecting a risk control strategy involves doing a feasibility study, a cost-benefit analysis. Then we can talk about qualitative versus quantitative, the pros and cons of each. This concept of risk appetite, what is the organization's risk tolerance? How much are they willing to accept? And then this idea of residual risk, and that's the amount of risk that will exist after we implemented all the safeguards that we have opted for. Thank you very much.